ahead and get started. So if everybody could take their seats, please. And just to make sure you're in the right room, this is about building and fire permitting and safety issues. All right, we're going to start off with introductions. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Jill Jennings-Golick, and I am one of the Deputy Directors for Community Planning and Development. And our agency oversees land use, building, inspections, as well as overall planning for our city.
I'm Nicole Skolmel. I'm the Operations Supervisor for Denver Fire in Fire Prevention.
Brian Lucas, I'm a Fire Protection Engineer in Fire Prevention Division.
Tony Ramirez, Denver Electrical Inspector.
My name is Eric Browning. I supervise the Architectural and Structural Plan Review Group for commercial buildings for the City and County of Denver.
All right, so we're going to be talking about building and fire issues today, and I was asked to make sure sometime probably in the very near future you all will be getting an email containing a link to an online survey, and so we would very much appreciate it if you would provide us some feedback about your experience at the last couple days at this conference. We really value that input, so please make sure you fill out that survey when you get it in your email inbox. All right, so I'm going to kick us off here. So community planning and development, we fit into the marijuana world on two fronts. We start the process with our zoning use permits, and that's what gives you the ability to do what you want to do at the particular site. And then our building folks come into play once they have submitted, a customer has submitted for a building permit application. So if you got to make changes to your building, upgrade the electrical service, move anything around, you're getting a building permit. And as part of that review, Denver Fire also comes in and they review all building permit submittals. And then our agencies as well are involved on the back end. So you've got your permits, you're out building, and then our folks are involved in the inspection process. And we also sign off on license cards for excise and license. So when a marijuana business is seeking to get licensed, our zoning neighborhood inspection services, as well as our building inspectors, sign off on that license card, as well as I believe Denver Fire does as well.
Thank you, Jill. So following up on the first couple steps of that workflow, we found that when we first started licensing and issuing permits and certificates of occupancy for the marijuana uses, a number of customers were not fully aware of the total process that was necessary in order to legally occupy a tenant space. What we found was that they would initiate and complete, for the most part, the zoning process, and they were under the impression that that was all they needed to do. And that didn't satisfy all of the needs from Denver Community Planning and Development and Denver Fire for life safety and occupancy perspectives. So that was really one of our biggest challenges. We ended up with a lot of technically illegally occupied spaces because the customer thought that having a zoning permit in hand was all they needed. So as Jill mentioned, and as you can see up here on this screen, there are a number of entities that are involved in the plan review and permitting process. Those include architectural and structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. Fire reviews are kind of the main hierarchy that you may be familiar with. In some instances, we may also have transportation reviews. This would be common if we had a site redevelopment plan or if this was a change of use from a different occupancy that had something to do with perhaps curb cuts, something that may affect the right-of-way or any other of the areas that transportation has jurisdiction. There are additional items that are required in some instances from a review and permitting perspective when it comes to community planning development and the City and County of Denver process. Those have to do with environmental health, and this deals with edibles or any kind of food service or processing or handling. And we also have serious and drainage review and permit requirements. That may have to do with any waste associated with processing or with operation, depending on what the tenant is using their space for.
I'm going to discuss about the building plan review, some of the common issues that arise, dealing with the electrical. A lot of times you have the continuous loads as far as what's the lighting in your grow rooms, mechanical equipment, rooftop units. A lot of times that's not specified on the plans. You have lighting coordination with other disciplines. That could be in your extraction rooms, lights on, off, if the equipment comes on and off. A lot of times there's a lack of listed equipment. That could be your ballast, your lighting fixtures. It all has to be listed. A lot of times, almost all the time, an upgraded electrical service is necessary due to the demands. You also, some issues with mechanical and plumbing, not specifying the plumbing fixtures, not specifying the ventilation, also not showing if it's an extraction, the extraction room on the plans, CO2 enrichment. Also, there's new requirements from environmental health as far as odor control. Sometimes that's going to require some modifications to the HVAC system. There's also architectural and structural. Is that you? Oh, I got carried away.
I'll steal your thunder, man. Sorry. So in addition to the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing items that Tony was talking about on the architectural and structural side, there are a number of key items that we look for and that also tend to be the most common offenders from a plan review and permitting perspective. As Tony mentioned, plumbing fixtures can certainly come into play because there are accessibility requirements associated with both the quantity and the use for those fixtures, especially in a change of use scenario. Accessibility is relevant, and those bathrooms, drinking water fountains, customer service counters, as well as site and building access are all prevalent in a number of the existing building conversions that we have here in Denver, or that we had. I think pretty much every warehouse has been bought or sold or leased at this point. But many of those warehouses were dock-high buildings, and so access from exterior parking to the building required a number of accessibility upgrades in order to provide service for the employees and for the customers. There are also means of egress concerns that come into play, whether we're dealing with grow rooms where we have very narrow aisles that may have actually very long dead ends that are of concern, or some situations where the proposed layout for plants or pods can block means of egress or existing doors that are required from a life safety perspective. A number of the buildings that we have in the area do not currently have sprinkler systems, and the threshold to install a system is quite large. And therefore, for non-sprinkler buildings, there may be fire-resistant rated corridor requirements, fire-resistant rated doors. We also have, the code defines a little shorter threshold on path of travel and dead ends for non-sprinkler buildings. The structural aspect requires a structural engineer often to take a look at the roof for additional rooftop units. Occasionally, we have lighting fixtures proposed that are simply so immense that they actually need to look at the existing ceiling and roof ceiling structure from a capacity perspective, just to hang the lights as well. The City and County of Denver has recently moved over to the 2015 series of international codes, with the exception of the 2014 NEC. And as a result, the 2015 Energy Code will be a big player in a number of these buildings, especially any new conversions that are coming up, because the lighting and mechanical are part of the process of the system. There are certain exemptions that exist in terms of those elements, but the building envelope itself must still comply with the Energy Code. There's one other very interesting item that we see, and I'm sure is prevalent in other areas as well. And that has to do with either emergency lighting or minimum illumination levels within these grow rooms. And more often than not, these systems are on timers, and they prefer 12 on, 12 off. And so any frog eyes or any other lighting that's within these rooms may not meet the minimum requirements of the building code from an egress illumination perspective, but that also is counter to the productivity or the efficiency of the plants to grow. So we've worked with industry to allow essentially these to be dark rooms that will activate if there's motion or occupancy, but that will also satisfy the industry's need to have areas dark when they in fact need to be dark. Okay, so in terms of a little bit of history, where Denver came from in terms of the marijuana occupancy classifications, we've essentially been working with two classifications and added a third in the mix when retail or recreational marijuana came into play. But it originally started with medical marijuana sales, which is a Group B occupancy per our definition, or was a Group B occupancy, because we correlated that most directly with a medical or a clinic type use. You typically have a doctor's prescription, and so for us that fit fairly well within kind of a doctor's office type of occupancy. The grows have pretty much always been F1 occupancies for us, and that it goes for existing buildings. That also applies to what some might consider a greenhouse. However, in Denver, the greenhouse designation does not fall well within the Group U occupancy that you might find for a typical agricultural building, and we still define those as F1 occupancies as well, which can create some challenges, but that's the threshold that we've set here in Denver. As we've moved forward in Denver to allowing retail recreational marijuana sales, we found ourselves challenged with a disparity between the more medical or clinic type occupancy designation versus the recreational, which in our perspective is really a retail or mercantile type of occupancy. And as a result, we're working to develop policies to clarify those existing occupancies that may be doing some conversions, as well as going forward, we'll be defining all marijuana sales as just a regular Group M occupancy.
All right, so I'm going to move us on to another challenge we have faced here in the city of Denver. So when the constitutional amendments were passed, they allowed for the personal use and growing of marijuana. And so eventually we had to come in and with our zoning regulations pass certain restrictions related to how many plants you could have and how many plants per dwelling unit. And that was the Constitution set 6. And then we decided, regardless of how many, let's say 21 years old and up adults were in a house, we in Denver limit you to no more than 12 plants per dwelling unit. There's no real restriction as to where they can be grown within a house, except if you're in an apartment building, they can't be grown in a common area, but it does have to be within an enclosed space. So what we have been seeing over the last year and a half, maybe 2 years now, is that folks are buying up houses, wanting to make them essentially rentals to allow them to be attractive to tenants that want to grow their own marijuana but haven't bought a residence, so they're a rental tenant. And so to allow this, they are wanting to put in separate electrical services to the detached garage of that house to essentially turn them into grow facilities. And so they're adding the same size electrical service, a 200 amp service that's on an existing house, to that garage, which is far more power than you need to grow your maximum of 12 plants. It's also, by doing this, they are wanting to add heating and cooling to what was previously an unconditioned space in your garage. That now, especially as we've adopted the 2015 Energy Code, as Eric talked about, kicks you in. You've got to comply with energy code requirements, and more than likely that slab your garage was built on is not factored in to deal with those added heating and cooling loads. And then, as I talked about, this load easily lets you do more than the 12 plants that our zoning laws allow you to do. Tony?
Some of the electrical implications that we do see in residential grows are there's a lot of potential for electrical fires. A lot of this work that's being done is done under the radar. It's not permitted, so we don't have the benefit to, there's no permits being pulled, no inspections. We've been out on some of these that there were fires. You have overloaded electrical panels. A lot of these older homes only have 100 amp services, and they're trying to rig stuff up, line side tapping from XL. We see all kinds of crazy stuff going on. Another thing is, like Jill mentioned, a lot of times they're wanting to put a separate electrical service on the detached garage and make that strictly for growing. And what we do see is they'll pull a permit for a service and make the garage just the minimum to meet code, but then we go back afterwards and it's electrical's all done crazy. You have extension cords, unlisted equipment, a lot of extension cords running through walls. It just gets real hazardous. And then there's also, as a fire department, if they don't know that there's two services on the property, they may only go disconnect one and not realizing they could be backfeeding and potential for death or something could happen to them.
So to address this issue, as we were working on the adoption of the 2015 codes, we actually made a local amendment to the International Residential Code. At first, I thought I had found our savior in Chapter 36 of the Residential Code to fix this issue, because it said, single family and duplex dwelling units are allowed one service, except that the code writers didn't include the definition of dwelling unit, so it didn't capture any accessory detached structures. So what you can see on the screen is the base language within the 2015 International Residential Code, and then our amendment that was approved by City Council earlier this year to this section to really make it clear that there is only one service, and that includes your accessory dwelling or accessory detached structure as well. And then we did put in an out, because I know I was quite concerned as we were working on this language, didn't want to eliminate the possibility that if for some reason you had an accessory dwelling unit over your garage and needed a separate service, that would not be totally permitted, so we put in that provision unless otherwise approved by the building official. So we've covered it in the residential code, and then we feel like we've also kind of covered it within zoning, because your detached accessory structure is supposed to be accessory. So when you suddenly give it the same level of electrical service as the house, it's really not accessory to that house anymore, and we're dealing with essentially two primary structures. But it's been I would say a year and a half, 2 years working on this, trying to figure it out. I don't know that we're there yet, but it's been a real challenge for us in Denver dealing with the illegal home growing to the point where they're beyond their allowed 12 plants. Yeah, go ahead.
So for the fire service individuals in the room, the reason behind that is that the disconnect issue is the majority of Denver is set up with an alley. The block has two streets with an alley out down the center, and the garages are usually off the alley. Power is pulled in from the back side of the building through the rear of the property. On a normal house fire, if you respond, you can usually find a disconnect either on the garage or on the house. So if you go to either one location, you throw the disconnect, it's common for our firefighters to assume that they've cut power to the property. And it was a concern for firefighters to go there and now have 2 disconnects, not knowing that the second disconnect was there. And that's why we supported and pushed for that single disconnect. That doesn't restrict you from bringing in another service. Technically, you can pull in a second 200 amp service and have it at the same location. But what that means is that you would bring in 200 services, have both disconnects at the same location. So you could feed your garage there and then feed the house, but those disconnects have to be, I think, within 3 or 10 feet of each other, right in a visual site.
Tony, you're up. Extraction equipment.
Okay, this dealing with extraction equipment. A lot of the equipment or the extraction is, a lot of the equipment has to be listed. And it has to be listed as a component. A lot of times you got part A, part B, and you're trying to make part C. Well, a lot of times that ain't gonna work. It has to be listed as a whole assembly. And then also, there's 2 ways to list equipment. You could have it listed by a nationally approved testing lab and tested to the appropriate standards, or it can be through a third party in the field. A lot of this equipment, again, it has to be listed as assembly, and that's from the NEC 110.3.
So I'll wrap up our part of the presentation by just talking a little bit about our challenges that we're facing right now. So Brian and Nicole get into this a little bit more, but the fire department recently made a decision on requiring Class 1 Division 1 rooms for butane extraction spaces. And so that does have some implications for us on the building side from an electrical and mechanical perspective, as well as zoning. Gotten a few calls on that as they have to enclose a room that was not previously enclosed. As Tony talked a little bit about, we're seeing a lot of equipment coming in, being used by this industry for purposes that it was not intended for. So paint booths, for example, are now being used quite a bit in the extraction process, which is good from a mechanical plumbing perspective, but challenging from environmental health as it requires a sink if they're handling anything that they consider food, which they typically consider extraction to be food. But that's certainly been a challenge for us because especially on electrical, everything has to be listed. And then we continue to see, although I think it's certainly reduced over the past 2 years that I've been here, unsafe conditions and work done without permits. Eric talked a little bit about that we had a lot of folks who got licensed and thought the zoning permit was enough. I think we've seen most of them come back in and get permits and get the required CO, but we still find that folks are still making changes out in the field and not coming in to get permits. And then I'll let Tony finish on a couple of the challenges he sees on the inspection front.
Yes, the inspection issues, a lot of times just improper installation of the materials that everybody uses. Unistrut is a good example. Unistrut is listed to be installed a certain way with certain accessories, and we just see all kinds of crazy stuff done with it. So that's one big key that we always harp on is it listed to do what you want it to do, or from the manufacturer. We've also developed some of a guideline to help electrical contractors, owners, and if you want, there is some of us from the inspections department right here. You can raise your hand. If you want to, if there's any other inspectors here that you want to talk to us about the inspections, feel free. We'll be here for a little while, and I can let you look over these guidelines. That's all.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview on Denver Fire and some of our kind of structure and then role in marijuana. Denver Fire has about 988 uniformed staff members and then 43 civilian or career service members. And then specifically in fire prevention, we have a dedicated marijuana group, and that group is made up of a lieutenant, 4 inspectors or technicians, 1 fire protection engineer, and then the program coordinator. And then this group reports directly to the assistant chief. Fire department, one of our major roles is in conducting inspections. I talked about this a little bit this morning as well, but the majority of the commercial inspections that we conduct are done by the operations crews. So that's going to be your local fire station coming in and doing an inspection, looking for building and fire code violations, and then also doing a pre-plan so that they have a layout of the facility in case there's an incident response there. Then there's also about 6,000 inspections that are conducted by fire prevention. Of those, we're going to have about 630 facilities that our marijuana group is going to inspect. We're going to inspect those twice annually, once in the first half and then once again in the second half of the year. Some of the other groups that participate and inspect in the marijuana facilities are also the Certificate of Occupancy and License group. That's a separate group, and they'll be coming out to sign those actual cards or license documents for you. Some of the things that we're kind of seeing and dealing with on the inspections are, oh, you know what? I'm sorry, I think I skipped one. Oh, I didn't, I guess. So there's another slide, but I'll just tell you about it. Fire department is kind of involved in everybody else's process that's here. So when you start with excise and license, you're going to make your application to excise and license, and then later on, fire department will be a sign-off on their license card. Same thing with the building department. So someone will go in and submit their building plans, and then the fire protection engineers are going to be one of the reviews on that. On the back end of both of those, the fire department will go out and sign those license and inspection cards, and then kind of concurrently, they'll make application to us for operational permits. Those operational permits are going to mirror the types of licenses they are applying for from excise and license. And then also they're going to be getting operational permits for their hazardous processes and then storage of hazardous materials, or so things like butane and their compressed gas that they're using for their CO2 enrichment and things like that. Related to the inspections, in addition to the certificate of occupancy and license sign-offs and some of those other inspections that we do, we're also going on referrals and incidents in marijuana facilities. And then we're looking at those sometimes as they can be illegal or possibly illegal or fully illegal. So sometimes we're kind of trying to determine, did they get the appropriate licenses and building permits and they're operating in compliance with all of those, or they may be somewhere in the middle. So there are a lot of locations where we spend a good deal of time kind of doing some research to figure out where they're at in that, or if they missed any pieces or parts, and then kind of trying to get them back up to speed. There may be some locations, for example, which are not licensed, but they're still going to be required to have building and fire permits. So there's kind of some gray areas. And then we also deal with the residential grow situations that Jill mentioned earlier. Like I already mentioned, we're going to be checking up on those construction permits and issuing the operational permits. Related to that, as you've heard throughout the symposium, there are all these evolving hazards and changes in the industry that we're basically constantly trying to keep up with. We're always looking at our policies. So the inspectors will go out in the field, they see something, and then they have to come back, look at whether or not our policy addresses it. If it doesn't, we may be having to take that to the fire protection engineers to look at the codes and figure out what we need to get into the code so that we can revise the policy so that then we can deal with it in the field. So it's quite a involved process, and we're kind of separated with the different locations that we operate out of and things like that. So there are some challenges we face there, but I think we're doing a great job. So Brian is going to get more in depth now on the plan review and permitting.
I'm going to stand and talk, if that's okay. So an overall picture of the marijuana industry in Denver and encompasses more than just the licensed businesses in Denver. We touch residential occupancies from home extractions. And if there's any jurisdictions in the room that are just starting off adopting policies for marijuana, residential occupancies was one where home extractions was an issue. The first couple years that marijuana was legalized, we had over 30 explosions or fires in marijuana related incidents in Colorado. Co-ops is kind of the gray area of the code. I think some other presentations today touched on them. Co-ops is kind of the gray area of you're not a licensed business, but you're operating in a commercial building because you are a caregiver growing plants for somebody else. That model has harbored illegal activities and non-compliant construction from a building and fire code standpoint. The reason that occurs is because there's no sign-offs like there is for a licensed business for you to get before you operate. So early on in the when marijuana was first legalized, we had caregivers or illegal growers moving into warehouses, growing thousands of plants, not pulling construction permits for electrical egress. A lot of times there'd be only one door in a 50,000 square foot warehouse because they illegally moved into the center. So that was restricted and capped at one point. The commercial side that we touch is the 4 areas of the license world: dispensaries, marijuana infused product manufacturing, growing, and testing labs. For this presentation, I'm just going to briefly touch on the first 2, residential occupancies and co-ops, and then some of the primary hazards in the infused product manufacturing and growing. So after we were seeing home extractions being an issue in Denver and Colorado, we originally dealt with them the best way we can, and if you don't have any laws in place to restrict this, you basically go back to a fire code section that says, don't do anything bad against the fire code, or don't create a dangerous environment or situation. It's general. It can be applied to pretty much any dangerous situation that can occur. The fines associated with it are pretty much like a speeding ticket and a general violation. So it didn't have much weight. The police department couldn't enforce that. It was a fire department enforce. Unless somebody got injured or something like that, then we can go with arson charges. So it was a burden on the fire department to go out and regulate that, and it really didn't have much impact. So by passing this ordinance locally, we restricted residential extractions to basically non-hazardous extraction methods and 16 ounces or less of alcohol on a non-heated or fuel-fired heating source. That was written in conjunction with the medical industry who wanted home extractions for medical use, children with seizures that they couldn't go out and buy. So that was the agreed upon 16 ounce that what we can allow in somebody's house to do an extraction. The state of Colorado soon adopted that and made it state law. And now I believe it has a felony charge after it. So the police can enforce this now, and it gives them a tool to enforce home extractions. Co-ops, as I said, this was a big burden on the fire department as far as illegal construction and non-compliant use of a structure. They didn't have certificates of occupancy. We had huge electrical issues, means of egress issues. In 2015, we passed an ordinance limiting to 36 plants per zone lot. And a zone lot could mean if you have a strip warehouse or a strip mall, the zone lot covers the entire space, so it's not tenant or building specific. So getting into, these are 2 pictures from a co-op. So the picture on the right, you can see there's nothing right about that electrical work. The picture on the left is a second story that was built inside of a building. So you can see they have like a pallet rack there that you'd find in Home Depot and the floor joists on top of it. So that was built inside of the building to make 2 stories out of a warehouse. So who knows if that's going to hold up with what's above it. It's not structurally engineered. These are the type of things we ran into early on. Every once in a while, we still come across them now, but it was rampant in 2010 and 2011 when the co-ops were a big issue. So getting into the license world, CO2 enrichment is one of the grow hazards that's immediate that needs to be regulated, in our opinion. The 2015 International Fire Code now has a CO2 beverage dispensing chapter. And the reason that is in there is because of several deaths across the US from leaky beverage dispensers in restaurants. The CO2 is used in the marijuana industry to enrich their environment to make plants grow faster. They're intentionally flooding their spaces with CO2. So if there's regulations around a restaurant because of a potential leak, the marijuana industry is intentionally pumping CO2 into their space, and we want to make sure that that's done correctly. In the fire code world, if somebody wants to put in a safety system for a fire alarm system to protect people, or a sprinkler system to protect people, or a building, there's a book you can turn to and it'll tell you what kind of pipe to use and how to do it. There is no CO2 enrichment in a publicly occupied building standard. So as of this year, we have a Denver amendment in our fire code that specifies how to put in and safely operate a CO2 enrichment system. So the systems usually operate at less than 1,500 parts per million. 5,000 is the OSHA 8-hour time limit for someone to be in there, 5,000. 40,000 parts per million is the immediate threat to danger, life, and health. The hazards are potential asphyxiation hazard. And the concern is not only in the growing space, but also maybe you're in a strip tenant building where you could have tenants next door. We're concerned about CO2 going next door, and not only in the space. So how do you do it? There's two primary ways that growers enrich their space. One is a CO2 generator. In the code world, it's called an unvented fuel-fired appliance. It's basically like burning a gas fireplace in your room without a chimney or a flue to the outside. So the dangers to that are, it's off-gassing CO2 as part of the combustion process, and it's also off-gassing carbon monoxide because of it's an unvented fuel-fired appliance. So we have two threats that we need to deal with when generators are used. That picture there is of on the left, there's a 100-pound propane tank there. We don't allow fuel-fired appliances to be fed by propane if the building has a gas supply. That's a Denver amendment. So typically, these are all piped with natural gas. So the two mitigation parts of that is CO2 detection and alarm. We require an automatic shutoff valve to the gas supply. The other one is a carbon monoxide alarm, which also shuts off the gas supply. But in addition, there is an exhaust fan from the space to vent it if the carbon monoxide alarm goes off. That model is typically built around a typical parking garage or a parking structure underground. They have similar CO detectors. When that goes off, they have vents kick on. The other way to do it is to use compressed or liquefied CO2. The picture on the left is an indoor, typical welding style cylinder arrangement. Most of those tanks are liquid carbon dioxide. The smaller tanks, it's converted to a gas and then pumped out into the space. Or you can have a bulk tank outside like the one on the right. So with these systems, we have a carbon dioxide hazard only, no carbon monoxide. We require signage. Piping from the tank to the distribution center has to be home run, and then from the distribution center to the rooms has to be home run. The deaths that occurred in the restaurants were leaks that happened at fittings. So if they want to have fittings or some other, we would require detection at any junction of pipe. Typically, everything's home run to one location, and there's a detector at the distribution center, and then one in every room that's enriched. There is a main fail closed shutoff valve required at the supply source. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit in more detail. And then emergency alarm. So amber strobes, you can see we require signage. Again, that's alarming at 5,000 parts per million. No interface to dispatch the fire department when it goes off. It's a local alarm only. And then an automatic shut off of the CO2 if that does alarm. That's a large bulk tank outside of a building. That main shut-off valve is shown there in blue. And then the picture on the left is a typical control panel that we see, and then the panel that's on the right next to it. Inside of there's a bunch of solenoid valves that everything's piped into, and that's the distribution center out to the grow rooms. The little thermostat-looking thing is the CO2 detector next to it. So with all that, we're good, right? We're safe. So we thought so. These are two failures that occurred. The one on the right, with a bulk CO2 tank, there's typically a vaporizer that's attached to a bulk CO2 supply that converts the liquid CO2 into gas, and then it's used throughout the piping system. The picture on the right was a failure of the vaporizer, and what happened was it started pushing liquid and dry ice through the system. It pushed it up into that control box inside the building, broke the valves, the solenoid valves, and filled the building with CO2. The alarm went off. The security guard heard the alarm and called the necessary people, and they came out and determined what it was. What didn't happen here when the alarm went off is the valve didn't close. And what we found out is that certain valves aren't rated to be used with a plug of dry ice in the line. So our fire code amendments now require that valve operate under all forms of the gas, solid, liquid, or a solid liquid or a gas form phase of the gas. So if there is a chunk of dry ice in it, there are valves out there that can close that valve. Picture on the left was a CO2. We were there on an inspection, and we didn't realize that the pressure rating of the black hose that was put there. Again, there's no standard for the piping system. There's no ASME. When we install a sprinkler system, there's sprinkler pipe that's listed for sprinkler systems. The CO2 industry doesn't have that, but it's common for them to use something called BevFlex, which is the white piping coming into that box, and what we accept, because there is no standard listing as there is in the fire protection world. So that has a really high rating. I think it's twice working pressure or more. But the black lines there were not, and they were max of 175, I think. They had a regulator problem at the tank. While we were there after the inspection, we heard a big loud pop, and we heard a whole bunch of gas letting out, and then the alarms went off, it shut off the valve, everything worked correctly. So that's the good side of regulation working there. If that happened at night, they could have dumped a bulk tank inside of a building and no one would have ever known. Until the guy got there in the morning and took a whiff when he opened the front door. So these systems are important. They're important to regulate and know what's inside your building, and not only for the occupants working there, but for people that could be next door in adjacent tenant spaces. So the last grow is sulfur burners. I think if you were in the inspection, we talked about these a little bit. These are we see them used commonly, unfortunately, in the business. What they're doing is burning elemental sulfur in an electrified pot that converts to sulfur dioxide. What happens is if that sulfur dioxide hits moisture, it turns into sulfuric acid. So if you take a breath of that, you're burning your lungs. That also corrodes CO2 detectors and any other sensitive electronics that might be in the room. We prohibit sulfur burners. Typically, there's not a way to exhaust a grow room after fumigation efforts. Usually they're pretty sealed because they want to retain their carbon dioxide that they're putting into the room. There's not a big ventilation fan on one end that you typically see in a greenhouse that might do this for tomatoes or something like that. This is typically done in the industry overnight. They turn that thing on, let it run overnight, hope it's done in the morning. The issue is that if you have a first responder coming in on a burglar alarm or a police officer coming in, he takes a breath of that, it could be a big issue for him. Same thing with the fire department or anybody coming in while that operation's going on. We do allow some pesticide fumigation. We require permits for that, posting of the building. Pesticide use, that's a picture of the application time. So after a pesticide is applied, the environment that you're in could be hazardous just because of the vapors coming off the pesticide you just sprayed on the plants. So that time has a half-life, and we require that to be posted on the door, pesticide applied and when it was applied and when it's safe to re-enter the room. Getting into extractions. So extractions are regulated under an F1 occupancy. There's basically 4 kind of ways that you can do it. Butane hash oil, which everyone's heard, carbon dioxide, both of those are liquefied gases under pressure. A flammable liquid extraction, basically you do your extraction with a flammable liquid, you do a soak and then you distill it off. If you are not in an area what restricts what can be used as a solvent, then basically any flammable liquid can be used. In Colorado, the state regulates the solvents that you can use for that extraction, which is good for us because there's some nasty solvents out there. I'm glad that they put that list together. Fourth method is basically a non-hazardous water extraction. You can freeze your plant material, run it through a bunch of sieves. There's also something called Rosentec that's coming out now, which is heat and pressure to create oil, squeezing it out of the material. After that extraction process is done, there's sometimes a further oil refining process. We call that post-oil processing in the Denver Fire Code, and the intent of that is to purify or make your oil stronger. Decarboxylation is also heating the oil to remove the THCA and convert to THC. So usually there's a heating process if that's going into a food product. One thing I'll touch on, which I forgot earlier, is that medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, as far as the fire code goes, there's no difference. So if you have medical legal in your area right now, you already have these problems. What happens when recreational gets approved is your problem gets a little bit bigger, maybe a lot bigger. Volumes of plant material, extraction processes get a lot larger, and that's what we see. But as far as growing, it grows in the same room, they use the same extraction equipment. As far as fire code concerned, there's no difference. So open blast extractions, the typical easy way to do it is shown on the left. That's usually what you see on a home fires that are being done and you find explosions. It's not limited to home extractions. The picture on the right is an illegal extraction in Denver from years ago where they hook a 100-pound tank and do an open blast extraction. So if you don't have rules in effect to limit this, they need to be put in place up front so this doesn't occur. We were finding this happen a lot, even on the commercial scale. You can see how much he's got there in the box that he's open blasting. You're basically standing in a cloud of flammable gas when you're doing this. We've had fires outside in the open air. It's a dangerous activity. So LPG extractions, basically 2 methods to do it. There's the state, as far as regulations go requiring this, we are lucky enough that the state code requires a closed loop system. That's not in the Denver Fire Code. The state requires that. And then as far as the equipment goes, we'll talk about the approval of the equipment. But there's 2 basic ways to do it. Closed loop system is an active and passive. The machine on the left is a passive system. It doesn't need electricity. It doesn't need a pump. They're moving butane around the system solely by thermal cycles, by heating and cooling whichever extraction chamber they want the butane to flow. The one on the right is assisted with a pump. That is an old picture that we used to approve an electrified pump in the room. In 2010, we didn't really understand their process, and there wasn't a classified area location. So those electrical pumps were used. So in the early days, it was a closed loop extraction system was required. We weren't expecting any releases of butane because it was a closed loop system. But we had some reservations, so we required 1 CFM per square foot of exhaust on the floor. That exhaust rate is typical in the fire code for hazardous materials, for storage areas. That 1 CFM per square foot, you kind of see a lot in the industry. And then a hydrocarbon alarm we required. We also required an engineering certification and approval process of the equipment. So we thought we were good, but we started to equip our inspectors with flammable gas monitoring, and they were walking in extraction rooms getting 100% LFL alarms on their meters, which the codes at that time didn't allow that, but we weren't expecting that to be there. So immediately we knew the electrical was wrong, and the exhaust system wasn't doing its job either. So that basically moved us to write the 2016 Denver Fire Code retroactively to all extraction facilities in Denver, mandating that they design to the requirements I'll talk about in a second. So this is one of those pictures with a flammable gas monitor there at the table going off at 100% LFL and an electrical outlet right behind it. That's a flammable environment on the table. And we'll talk about work area and exhaust systems in a second, but even this room had 1 CFM per square foot across the floor of the room, and it's doing absolutely nothing for those vapors. That's a flammable location right at that location. The other thing we were hearing was pouring early. So the safest extraction is to recover all of your butane out of your equipment to make sure that most of the gas can be, as much that can be collected as possible is collected before you open the system. But in a manufacturing environment, that kind of slows down your operation. And if you want to get your machine loaded again and rerunning, this is a video of them pouring early, sideways, sorry. So that's liquefied butane mixed up with hash oil, off-gassing, which is why it's bubbling. That's a flammable location, without a doubt. So there's 3 basic extraction hazards in a butane extraction room. 1 is the equipment itself, 2 is the time that they retrieve their oil, and the 3rd is the time that they're off-gassing their spent plant material. When they pull a sock or dump their marijuana out of their plant material, that's soaked with butane and it off-gasses. All of those operations were over the 100% LFL mark. We also have concerns with the equipment and operator use. This is a picture of extraction equipment coming apart on security camera. I'm going to click through it. There's a lady sitting, kind of standing right in this corner. She's standing right there. As soon as she turns around, the machine comes apart. It wasn't put together right. The machine hit the ceiling and separated a 12-inch exhaust duct. The gas fell to the floor. She ran into the door because the door didn't swing in the direction of egress, and the cloud did not ignite, luckily, because if it did, it would have been a bad day to be in that room at that location. There is electrical all over that room. By definition in the NEC, that's a Class 1 Division 2 location because it's a potential failure. There was a refrigerator around the corner running, a computer on the desk, there was an exit sign there. This is the video from the New Mexico. I don't know if you've all seen this or not. Couple things I just want to point out. I'm going to play the video. It may be graphic for some people to watch, but if you do watch, which further required why we made our changes retroactively, is the doors have to swing in the direction of egress. This gentleman here runs into 2 doors and they didn't open. 2 is that this room is filled with butane. Although there's a fire that occurs here, right where the guy's kneeling down, if you look in the top corner of the screen, when the video plays, you'll see the flash go all the way over to there because the room is filled with butane. They use non-odorized gas, so you can't determine whether you're standing in an environment that's filled with gas. I'm gonna play it quick. So, I haven't investigated the fire, but this is a closed-loop machine. From what I can determine, I don't think the machine failed. I think that gas in the room came off of the slab that he just poured there. And he's using a heat gun, and that's the ignition source. But this wasn't even a failure of an equipment like the last picture that I showed you, and it did that much damage to the room and the personnel inside the room. So where does that leave us today is the 2016 Fire Code in Denver, which is retroactive with a compliance date of October. So this month, they need to be in compliance. Class 1 Division 1 electrical. I showed you all of our meters going off. That by definition is a Class 1 Division 1 location because you have vapors present during your normal operation. Class 1 Div 2 is a location where you have a potential or an accidental release. This is not an accidental release. We know that they have vapors present. So it's a Class 1 Division 1 location. We require that all of the metal in the room be grounded and bonded in accordance with the NEC. Hazardous exhaust system. A hazardous exhaust system with an emphasis on capture and containment provisions. So the IMC 510 requires that you have velocity across your work area. That doesn't mean I can recirculate air in the room. It has no bearing on air changes. It's a velocity across your work area. So there's 3 ways that extraction rooms are being designed. One is with a walk-in lab hood. Those are typically designed in the normal laboratory industry standards to have 100 feet per minute across their lab hood. 2 is with some sort of spray booth. If they use that concept, we don't allow the engineers to call it a spray booth. It's an extraction room and a hazardous exhaust system. And they need to specify that when they design it, because it's not being designed as a paint booth. Paint booths, by design in the fire code, require 100 feet per minute across the booth itself. So across the whole entire section of the booth, you have a velocity of 100 feet per minute. The third way is make your own system. And to do that, we're basically looking at the same airflow requirements. We've had multiple submittals of an exhaust system supplying high with exhaust down low on the floor that does nothing for an air flow across the room, capturing vapors at their source. You need to have a velocity across your entire work area. The picture that I showed you with the alarm going off with the can of oil there, there's no velocity across that work area. And if there was, that meter shouldn't have gone off. There should be velocity across there capturing any vapors. Non-combustible construction of the room or the booth. If the booth is in compliance with the Chapter 4 booths, we will accept that as a room. If you put in a walk-in lab hood, we do require you to build a room around that walk-in lab hood. All doors have to swing in the direction of egress with panic hardware. Continuous gas detection system, fire suppression system in the hood or booth, or if you design your whole room, it will be in your whole room. And then engineered equipment. We have an engineering equipment approval process for CO2 extractors and LPG extractors. The reason why is because there's no listing for them. So engineers will submit a report that gets approved. Once that's approved, the manufacturer sells the equipment, and then that engineer goes on site and gives us a letter that says, this equipment is how I engineered it and it's correct. He signs and seals that and gives it to us, and that's our insurance that what was designed and submitted is correct out in the field. So where we draw the line between transfilling and the extraction equipment is shown in this diagram. Usually, there is a supply tank hooked to the extraction equipment itself, and that's used in the closed loop process. That supply tank has to be filled, typically from a 100-pound supply tank or bulk tank. That filling process is regulated the same way you would take your propane grill cylinder to the hardware store and get filled. We don't allow that option to occur indoors unless you're in compliance with 58, NFPA 58, which has a lot of restrictive requirements that nobody's wanted to do yet in Denver. So usually at all times there's a location outdoors, and that's their transfilling location. and that location is regulated strictly out of NFPA 58 for distances. CO2 extraction hazards. It's a high-pressure piece of equipment. They operate from 5 to 10,000 PSI. So we want to ensure that the equipment is engineered. That's why we require the engineering certification of that. CO2 equipment also has typically a bunch of electrical components associated with it. They talked about the listing requirement before for extraction equipment. This is where the listing comes in. Although they submit the engineering approval, that doesn't cover the electrical wiring of the equipment. So we require these to be listed as well by a third-party nationally recognized testing laboratory. We've had equipment come in from out of the country that didn't use standard wiring colors and wiring methods that we see in the US. So that's something that we want to ensure for electrical safety for a normal appliance in a commercial building. As far as the rooms go for these, we still require it to be in a dedicated room with doors that swing in the direction of egress. We don't require a non-combustible construction. And then any reliefs or discharges from the equipment have to be piped outdoors. Typically, they use copper piping. Flammable liquid extractions or post-oil processing. The only difference as far as construction requirements is usually, or as far as their operations, is that usually there's a soak process is when they do an extraction. So it could be an open vat, it could be a big stainless steel pot that they fill up and with alcohol and do an open soak, and then they take it off and then distill that alcohol that's left over. We require all of the alcohol operations to be done under an exhaust hood of any distillation methods. A lot of times for post-oil processing, they'll use rotary evaporators. So they'll take their CO2 or LPG extracted oil, dissolve it in alcohol, and then freeze it, and then distill off that leftover solution. Rotary evaporators, that process, the dispensing of alcohol, they should all have a lab hood there, and we do require that. If it's an open system, we draw the line at 5 gallons. If it's a system that's over 5 gallons, we consider that hazardous exhaust, and that's when we start requiring suppression in the hood. If it's a small operation, less than 5 gallons, typically in an enclosed distillation operation like a rotary evaporator, we're just looking for that to operate in the hood without suppression. Room constructions are again similar, and usually we don't get an engineering approval for alcohol extraction equipment because all the ones that have seen so far that there is listing standards out there to do distillations with flammable liquids. So this can be listed typically either using laboratory equipment or they can list it to a standard that's already available. This is a soak process. So that's a ribbon blender, typically used in the food industry. That's filled up with alcohol and plant material and stirred and soaked. That's an open flammable liquid process. The other one is a soak that happens in a column. So they force alcohol over the top of it into a container and then do a distillation. These are all forms we see. There's a million different ways to do a distillation after for post-oil processing or for finalizing your extraction. The rotary evaporator is something we see commonly. The middle one is something called a solvent extractor. That was designed typically for paint spraying operations. At the end of the day, you have a bunch of dirty chemicals from cleaning your guns. You put it in the machine, and it'll strip the contaminants from the flammable liquid that you use to clean your spray gun, and then they can reuse it for cleaning again the next day. The marijuana industry has taken that equipment and used it to do extractions the same way, except the garbage that's left over is their hash oil. The third one is a whiskey still on a hot plate. There's many different ways to do it. That's a non-compliant way to heat a whiskey still. But you name it, if you can boil or heat up alcohol to distill it, it's out there. So I talked about the post-oil processing, and freezing. If they're doing that operation, typically there's a chilling part of the operation, the post-oil processing. A lot of times they put it in the refrigerator and it separates like soup. You get your fat come up to the top. That's basically garbage that they can skim off and then purify their oil and then do their distillation. The problem is that refrigerators aren't rated to have flammable liquid stored in them. We've had these are internet photos of exploded refrigerators. We've had one explode in Denver. We look for, as part of the plan review process, that if they're doing post-oil processing, that we want a flammable liquid rated refrigerator. And there's two different types. One's flammable liquid rated, the other one's explosion proof. A typical laboratory flammable liquid refrigerator just has the inside compartment separated from the compressor. An explosion proof one can operate in a Class 1 Division 1 location, which this is not. So typically the minimum requirement is a flammable liquid rated refrigerator. And that's all I got. Open up to some questions.
I will just note real quick as people want to come up to the microphone for questions. Our fire and building code amendments, you can find them online. If you go to denvergov.org/building code, we actually are in the midst of proposing some additional clarifications to our codes that we adopted earlier this year. So you can also find that on that website. And you'll see, I think, some of the tweaks they're proposing, Denver Fire's proposing for the CO2 and some of the extraction as well. Any questions?
We also have a guideline to kind of put our amendments into common English for those of you that don't like reading fire codes. We have a bunch of guidelines and policies on the fire department website under permits and marijuana.
Hi, my name's Kathy. I'm a building official from the state of Florida. I'm just curious, in the state of Florida, we have an agricultural exemption for working farms, and the building code doesn't, and the fire prevention codes do not apply. Do you have anything like that here? And if so, how do you address trying to do the extraction or the grows out on agricultural property?
So Denver requires any growing of marijuana to be an enclosed structure. So we don't have any that are outside or that wouldn't be subject to our zoning, building, and fire codes, to the best of my knowledge.
I don't know of any agricultural restrictions here.
And we also require the grow operations to be defined as an F1 occupancy, which does not fall under the Group U agricultural designation in the building code.
So it's my understanding that City and County of Denver just started licensing short-term rentals. And so my question is, can you share any of the discussions that may or may not have happened about allowing the non-licensed marijuana uses in a short-term rental?
I'm not sure what you're getting at. As far as short-term rental, the only thing I can think of that occurs there is smoking, which isn't under the regulation of this group. As far as extracting, they're under the extraction ordinance that was passed. That ordinance, if that's what you're referring to, is written for any location outside of a licensed business. So if you don't have a license to extract, if you don't have a MIP license from the city of Denver, you fall under that regulation. I'll make a note where that's becoming an issue that's on our radar that we're going to look at is the hemp industry. The hemp industry does not get licensed by Excise and License in Denver. So if you want to do hemp extractions in Denver, you fall underneath the home extraction ordinance because you don't have a license. So we are looking to rewrite that and deal with the hemp that's now seems to be blossoming. But I don't know if that answers your question or not. But.
So I know Councilwoman Kendra Black, it sounded like you might have something to add. I know that there was a growing kind of industry of short-term rentals because most hotels you can't smoke in. There is no public consumption currently that's allowed in Denver or the state, though we have a measure on the ballot specifically in Denver to address that. But I wasn't personally involved in the short-term rental conversation, so I can't say specifically what there was discussed around marijuana. But if you'd like to add anything, please feel free.
Asking about people using marijuana in short-term rentals?
Not so much the use, but the grow or some of the legal extraction uses that happen in a single-family dwelling. If, now that these are short-term rentals, are they considered a lodging, kind of a separate use? And like a hotel, and
No.
they would still be permitted in a short-term rental?
So so the regulations that were passed in Denver related to short-term rentals require it to be the primary residence of the person living there. So we are not changing their occupancy classification. It's still considered a single-family home and not a lodging use.
Hello, Ken Heim from Honolulu, Hawaii. This question really goes out to Brian, I believe. So I wasn't clear at the company level for the fire department, at the company level, are they, when they're doing their inspections, are they also looking at all the documentation that's required? And then if they don't find the proper documentations and licenses, then they would refer that to the proper agency?
So at the company level, they don't inspect marijuana occupancies.
Okay.
If they do inspect it, they'll do it for a pre-plan only. All marijuana occupancies are inspected out of fire prevention. We consider that a special hazard, and that's inspected by our dedicated marijuana inspectors.
Okay, and then one other one. When they're doing the pre-plans, is there a way for the companies to refer to and identify residentials that have multi-service lines coming into the house?
There is not.
Yeah, because we have like a hoses program where we can identify certain hazards and we can input those in, but
We have implemented a safety notes section, so if they do
Right.
come across a pre-plan or a building that they do want, they can put in safety notes, and I think that they come up if there's an incident at that location that they can see.
right on. Thank you very much.
Hey, did Denver work with NFPA on their revised safety codes because they're including marijuana in their
So
revisions?
I sat on NFPA 1 task force.
Oh, fantastic. Are you able to speak to how that may change how the city and county operates?
So as far as fire code goes in the United States, there's two codes. There's the International Fire Code, and then there's NFPA 1. The overall majority of the United States follows the International Fire Code, as does Denver. NFPA, I sat on that task force, and they are implementing a marijuana chapter. It's pretty similar to Denver's, written slightly differently. They do their codes a little differently. And that was done with input from fire officials. There was marijuana industry sitting there, engineers, and that. So that is getting adopted. If you're in a state or a jurisdiction that adopts that, that will become your fire code. I am pushing NFPA to come up with a standard, an operating standard for the marijuana industry. I hope that that's the next step. That way there's going to be a national baseline for the marijuana industry. There's other national standards for woodworking out of NFPA. For spray finishing, there's standards for every operation like that everyone's come together and come up with a base construction. The fire code isn't a good spot to put all of the requirements. There needs to be a movement to standardize the construction of extraction equipment. The fire code isn't a place to do that. Right now, it's left up to the engineers to do. So hopefully that's the next step out of that. But yeah, there is a movement to do that.
Hi, I'm Anita Black. I'm an assistant fire marshal in Sarasota. And I was curious on the CO2 enhancement rooms. During your planning process, do you require any type of an abort button in the event of a leak like you did the old Halon, like we used to do for the old Halon systems? I didn't see that in any of the documentation.
There is not an abort button. It's automatic through the detection system. The system's constantly running. So if a detector picks it up, we're confident that any place there will be a leak, that we have a detector at that location. So all of the enriched rooms have detectors in it. At the control panel, the distribution center, there's a detection there. Otherwise, that's why we require everything to be home run with piping that's rated for pressure that can, even if it's, I think it's double their working pressure coming out of the tank. So if there is an overpressurization of the pipe, hopefully the failure will occur at the distribution center location where we have protected.
Thank you.
Last chance, any other questions? All right, well, thanks everybody on the panel, and thank you all for attending, and don't forget to fill out that survey.